Part 2. What the Frenchman did for species between England and France I will do with forms. Charles Darwin. For him, the form was the work itself. As in living creatures, the blood, nourishing the body, determines its very contour and external aspect, just so, to his mind, the matter, the basis, in a work of art, imposed, necessarily, the unique, the just expression, the measure, the rhythm, the form in all its characteristics. Walter Pater. 5. The Word made flesh. Protoplasmic predications in Arthur Macken's The Great God Pan. Nature, if we believe all that is said of her, would be the most extraordinary being. She has horrors, horror vacui, she indulges in freaks, lusus naturae, she commits blunders, errors naturae, monstrum. She is sometimes at war with herself, for, as Gerald has told us, nature produced barnacles against nature, and of late years we have heard much of her power of selection. Nature is sometimes used as meaning simply matter, or everything that exists apart from spirit. Yet more frequently nature is supposed to be itself endowed with independent life, to be working after eternal and invariable laws. Again, we sometimes hear nature used so as to include the spiritual life and the intellectual activity of man. We speak of the spiritual nature of man, of the natural laws of thought, of natural religion. But while nature seems thus applicable promiscuously to things material and spiritual, human, and divine, language certainly, on the other hand, helps us to distinguish between the works of nature and the works of man, the former supplying materials for the physical, the latter for the historical sciences, and it likewise countenances the distinction between the works both of nature and of man on one side, and the divine agencies on the other, the former being called natural and human, the latter supernatural and superhuman. F. Max Muller, The Science of Language, 1864-66. No student of the science of language can be anything but an evolutionist, for, wherever he looks, he sees nothing but evolution going on all around him. F. Max Muller, The Science of Thought, 1887. For all that she had made the requisite conciliatory gestures, having written, at mid-career, her own version of a visionary novel in which her readers were granted a fleeting glimpse behind a lifted veil, 1859, and having distinguished, at career's close, between works of visionary excitement, embodying a passionate vision of possibilities and the sensibility of the artist seizing combinations which science explains and justifies, and works by strictest reasoners, who generated an illusory world in the shape of axioms, definitions, and propositions, with the final exclusion of facts signed QED. George Eliot had failed to convince some of her more aesthetic readers that she was anything but the charwoman of choice for the Pentonville Transit Authority, lavishing attention on a world of tangible verities that they derogated as little more than a variegated shadow veiling what Arthur Machen viewed as un. Monde de grands mystères, de choses insoupçonnées et tout à fait defiance. One to Machen the poor, dreary, draggle-tailed George Eliot seemed hardly capable of lifting veils, since she was one of the pitiable ones fettered by it. Unshakable but mistaken faith in the importance of the detrital minutiae that constituted these chases in eras, dreams in a career, the stuff of dreams and shadows that hide the real world from our eyes, to believing that the true realist Keats, for example, and especially Poe, whom Machen dubbed the supreme realist, understood that the whole earth, down to the very pebbles, was merely a frustratingly impenetrable barrier veiling a quickening and adorable secret. Machen sought an idiom capable of unmasking the delight-sent world, in a cult style in which, as Simon suggested, the visible world is no longer a reality, and the unseen world no longer a dream. 3. Machen's The Novel of the White Powder, 1895, a story of the mid-90s, fleshes out the contours and image patterns of his chosen idiom. One of several apparently disparate but ultimately related narratives that, taken together, enable his protagonists to identify the individuals referred to by the title of The Three Impostors, 1895, The Novel of the White Powder. Machen's variation on Poe's facts in the case of M. Valdemar, 1845, tells the story of Francis Lester, a London law student whose too ambitious course of study undermines both his health and his spirits. His elderly family physician, Dr. Haverden, proposes to remedy this mischief in the nervous system with a prescription that ought to do great things, and an aged apothecary provides him in turn with an innocent-looking white powder, for his character is so transmuted that, within a few days, the formerly relentless student becomes a lover of pleasure, a careless and merry idler of western pavements, a hunter out of snug restaurants, and a fine critic of fantastic dancing. 164. As the story progresses, he becomes more and more dissipated, his tame Epicureanism giving way to an ominous indulgence in secret lusts that eventually betray themselves on his body. While Dorian Gray's Epicurean appetites act as a reminder that what serves the senses may slay the spirit, Lester's prove that what initially seems to minister to the body may in fact hasten its corruption. The former reads his portrait for external signs of his spiritual malaise, the visible emblem, as he puts it, of conscience, whereas the latter actually becomes the embodiment of physical corruption. 5. What begins as a small patch about the size of a sixpence, and somewhat of the color of a bad bruise, 165, eventually consumes his whole body, for when, at the story's climax, his sister and Haverden force their way into the bedroom in which he has barricaded himself, they discover upon the floor only a dark and putrid mass, seething with corruption and hideous rottenness, neither liquid nor solid, but melting and changing and bubbling with unctuous oily bubbles, like boiling pitch. All that remains of the once eminently presentable young man are two burning points like eyes, and a writhing and stirring as of limbs, and something that might have been an arm. 177. These extraordinary events, as we discover in a postscript written by Dr. Chambers, to whom the apothecary's originally innocuous white powder had been given for analysis, have their origin in a peculiar accident. Over the course of many years the powder had been subjected to certain recurring variations of temperature with varying degrees of intensity and duration, 182, and was in consequence transmuted into the vinum sapidi, the sacramental wine of the black mass. Chambers is not surprised to learn of Lester's fate, for in his own earlier days as a confirmed skeptic and materialist, he had himself discovered that, during the Black Mass, those who consume the vinum sapidi experience both a temporary physical regression to a primal state and a spiritual revelation. Machen's version of the Freudian primal scene, the house of life was riven asunder and the human trinity dissolved, and the worm which never dies, that which lies sleeping within us all, was made tangible and an external thing, and clothed with a garment of flesh. And then, in the hour of midnight, the primal fall was repeated and represented, and the awful thing veiled in the mythos of the tree in the garden was done anew. 18,384. To Chambers, a world in which such things are possible seems as strange and awful as the endless waves of the ocean seen for the first time, shining, from a peak in Darien, 180. Among other things, Then, the novel of the white powder provides Mackin with an opportunity to paraphrase and update Keats, who, on first looking into Chapman's Homer, 1816, had compared himself to stout Cortez, though he meant Vasco Núñez de Balboa, the explorer who, in the company of his awestruck men, had starred at the Pacific/Silent, upon a peak in Darien. In his guise as adventurer/explorer, Keats identifies Homer's world, which is really his own world, stripped of what Mackin described as veils of apparent monotony and meanness, the three impostors, 128, as being one of those realms of gold and goodly states into which he longed to escape. Mackin's Dr. Chambers is similarly awed and humbled by the revelation of the existence of a world that, like the one that Keats had discovered, is not readily accessible to the senses, although it is clothed with a garment of flesh, 184. In Chapman's Homer, however, Keats breathes pure serene when at length he penetrates to Homer's domain, whereas Mackin's characters are destroyed by their unanticipated glimpse of an appalling reality that lies behind all that they have hitherto known. Although crediting them with being the first to recognize that the spectacle of external nature implied much more than mere pleasantness or sensuous beauty, since it could impart a revelation of things hidden in things which are open to all things more splendid and more awful than we used to dream, the three impostors, 181, Mackin maintained that the romantics were necessarily limited in the extent to which they could transcribe the secret language that nature itself had revealed to them. Coleridge and his fellows, he argued, were but the forerunners of a new doctrine which was not fully revealed to them. 6. The runic characters of the secret language were embedded within the material forms of a world more prosaically present, although for Mackin no less sacrosanct for having been probed, its occulted mysteries raised to the surface and scrutinized by the scientist whose exploratory motives Tyndall had lauded. The world at whose existence Mackin hints in such stories as the white powder and the great god Pan is, as we shall see, nothing less than a tremendous sacrament, a mystic, ineffable force and energy, veiled by an outward form of matter, the three impostors, 181, but it is a sacrament that most of us, surfeited on the lethargy of custom, are capable of apprehending only in a dim and broken and imperfect manner. It is a Catholic lexicon that we recognize when we find the universe described, even in his horror stories, as a great sacrament, and it is a Catholic sensibility that informs Mackin's sense of sin as an effort to gain the ecstasy and the knowledge that pertain alone to angels, so that in making this effort man becomes a demon. Death or madness await those doomed characters who, either by accident or in a misguided attempt to obtain something which was never theirs, repeat a fall into damning knowledge. Point 7. It required, not another Champollion to decipher the symbolic strai expressive of inward movements and hidden motions, but someone sufficiently skilled to create a literary style capable of translating nature's circumambient, if esoteric, style. In his appropriately entitled Hieroglyphics, 1902, Mackin announced that style was the outward sick sign of the burning grace within the linguistic equivalent of a sacrament, defined in the Book of Common Prayer as an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace aid by extension. Then, style became the linguistic analog of a sacramental world that it anatomized. Recalling Wilde's credo that nothing can cure the soul but the senses, just as nothing can cure the senses but the soul, Mackin noted that the way to the spiritual things is by the gate of the sensible things, insisting that, by its capacity when exquisitely arranged of suggesting wonderful and indefinable impressions, literature causes the delicious sensations that make one viscerally responsive to occult mysteries and the mysterious letters that express them. Point 9. The telltale trope by which Mackin distinguished his own body of work is appropriately outward, visible, incarnate and drawn, moreover, from the physical sciences that had helped to darken the glass through which he surveyed, as if for the first time, a world grown manifestly strange and awful. Moreover, he found his significator in the arguments of someone who, like his Dr. Chambers, was a confirmed skeptic and materialist, someone appreciative of but not likely to have been put off by Mackin's veiled warnings of the dangers to which one seeking greater insight into first principles might be exposed, someone for whom the material world provided an end in itself, all other considerations appearing chimerical. Mackin, for his part, fixed on a protoplasmic metaphor that suited his aims too well and captured perhaps too fully the hidden labors, evolutions, and devolutions of a language fleshed out in the outward vestiture of matter. We live in a world which is full of misery and ignorance, and the plain duty of each and all of us is to try to make the little corner he can influence somewhat less miserable and somewhat less ignorant than it was before he entered it. This was the end toward which Huxley was working as part of a lifelong task in his essay on the physical basis of life, in which he sought to establish definitively that a semi-fluid, semi-transparent, colorless substance called protoplasm must be the physical basis of life, and that this viscid compound was common to all the diversities of vital existence common to the microscopic fungus, the body of the living fly, the great fin whale, and the flower which a girl wears in her hair and the blood which courses through her youthful veins. 129-30. Huxley's essay was published in the February 1869 issue of the Fortnightly Review, 3 months after he had delivered his lecture on the subject at a public forum in Edinburgh. Both the talk and the essay that followed were extravagantly successful. The number of the Fortnightly featuring Huxley's essay ran into 7 reprintings, and John Morley, then editor of the Fortnightly, claimed that no article that has appeared in any periodical for a generation back, unless it be Deutsch's article on the Talmud in the Quarterly of 1867, excited so profound a sensation as Huxley's memorable paper on the physical basis of life, 1869. The stir, he went on to say, was like the stir that in a political epoch was made by Swift's conduct of the Allies, or Burke's French Revolution 11. Even the American popular press took note of what the New York World described as Huxley's remarkable discourse on a new theory of life. It is worth noting that hypotheses about a basic living substance had been put forth years before Huxley delivered his lecture. Point 12. He merely did for protoplasm what he had done for Darwinian biology. He bulldogged it, introducing into a public forum what had previously been consigned to scientific journals. As historian Gerald L. Geisen has it, Huxley made protoplasm quite literally a household word. 13. Putting protoplasm into the mouths of his readers, however, was not necessarily the sole or even the primary reason he had taken up this topic of discussion. A subheadline from the World's transcription of the essay indirectly touches on Huxley's ulterior motive, matter the basis of vitality. Huxley was in fact out to kill vitalism. Vitalists argued that the distinction between living things and inanimate matter lay in the fact that the former were infused with and operated upon by certain unique and mysterious processes that could not always be identified or explained and might even involve the supernatural, or what Lionel Smith Bale, the most eloquent of the vitalists, cautiously described as the intervention of some wonderful power or agency. 14. Huxley, however, would have no part of the occulting of matter of the conception of life, that is, as a something which works through matter, but is independent of it. 129. He believed that knowledge, cognition, and feeling, which we rightly name the higher faculties, were all firmly grounded in matter, originating, in some instances, in transitory changes in the relative positions of parts of the body. 131. It may seem a small thing, he reasoned, to admit that the dull vital actions of a fungus, or a foraminifer, are the properties of their protoplasm, and are the direct results of the nature of the matter of which they are composed. But if, as I have endeavored to prove to you, their protoplasm is essentially identical with, and most readily converted into, that of any animal, I can discover no logical halting place between the admission that such is the case, and the further concession that all vital action may, with equal propriety, be said to be the result of the molecular forces of the protoplasm which displays it. And if so, it must be true, in the same sense and to the same extent, that the thoughts to which I am now giving utterance, and your thoughts regarding them, are the expression of molecular changes in that matter of life which is the source of our other vital phenomena. 140. In other words, he suggested, since the realm of matter is coextensive with knowledge, with feeling, and with action, thought may be regarded as a property of matter. 143, 145. Knowing this to be the case, the right thinking materialist and skeptic could then dispense with what Huxley terms lunar politics, involving questions about matters of which, however important they may be, we do know nothing, and can know nothing. 144 to 45. As a skeptic, then, Huxley stands with Hume, whom he quotes in his own defense. If we take in hand any volume of divinity, or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. 144. Pater may be thought of as having taken Hume's advice to heart when he committed not his school metaphysics but himself to the flames, or at least to the often invoked hard, gem-like flame that would allow him to engage in some uniquely human way with, and at the same time to protect himself from, the flux of a world that was impressing itself too materially upon him. 15. He was not, however, responding directly to the terms of the argument as set forth in Huxley's essay, for his equally notorious conclusion had made its first unassuming appearance as an unsigned review titled Poems by William Morris in the Westminster Review of October 1868, a month before Huxley addressed his audience in Edinburgh. The materialism driving Huxley's argument reflecting what a commentator in an 1869 issue of Macmillan's magazine called the secular habit of mind that has for some time had the predominance at Oxford became increasingly pervasive in 19th century scientific and philosophical discourse. 16. One need not venture very far afield for evidence of the growing fear that a critical mass of quantifiable physical research, what a disturbed Stevenson would characterize as this mountain mass of the revolting and the inconceivable, threatened to render immaterial the immaterial. 17. The grammar of materialism holds temporary sway in Pater's essay, which begins, quite self-consciously, with that which is without our physical life. 217. The first half of the conclusion is freighted with references to phosphorus and lime and delicate fibers, to the passage of the blood, the waste and repairing of the lenses of the eye, to the tissues of the brain, to currents and pulses, and to the microscopes that make these things known to us. 217. 219. Amidst this perpetual flux we recognize that the clear outline of face and limb is but an image of ours, a design in a web. 217 to 18. Fashioned by individuals patterning themselves after the mythical shipwrecked sailor who, feeling similarly oppressed by cosmic inscrutabilities, spent 28 years in erecting fences, drafting charts, laying in supplies of comestibles, and renaming people in the enormously influential and what is by now the almost too well known conclusion to the conclusion. Pater declares that art alone generates the wisdom, the poetic passion, the desire of beauty that can trigger the quickened, multiplied consciousness that is the only compensation available to one allotted accounted number of pulses only of a variegated, dramatic life. 219 to 20. For Pater, art and artifice maintain an inviolable presence in an organic world held hostage by natural elements and elementary forces. 217. Although emerging within and perhaps compounded of the material agents of an organic world, art constitutes what Pater 3 years earlier, in his essay on Coleridge, had determined to be a new presence in the world. He could not therefore countenance the Romantics having likened art to a living organism, because such a comparative, although it expresses the sense of a self-delighting, independent life which the finished work of art gives us, hardly figures the process by which such work was produced, since it reduces the artist to a mere mechanical agent and the artwork itself to some blindly organic process of assimilation. It substitutes a blind ferment of lifeless elements for the exquisite analysis, the calculating, the most intuitive, the power of the understanding in them, their logical process of construction, the spectacle of a supreme intellectual dexterity which works of imagination afford. 18. Like philosophers and creators of fiction, individual members of the demonized scientific community were haunted by what Huxley referred to as this great truth of materialism that weighs like a nightmare upon many of the best minds of these days. 143. Like Pater, some sought refuge in the notion that certain artifacts were essentially immune to what Stevenson would call the disease of agglutinated dust that smites the monstrous spectre man. 19. The German philologist F. Max Muller, for example, advanced what might be viewed as a vitalistic argument for language, granting the validity of Darwin's otherwise chastening theory of the descent of man, a theory inevitable, but hardly welcome. He balked at the notion that language is materially based, that it had evolved, that is, out of imitative shrieks and gestures common both to man and to beast. 20. However much the frontiers of the animal kingdom have been pushed forward, so that at one time the line of demarcation between animal and man seemed to depend on a mere fold in the brain, he argued, there is one barrier which no one has yet ventured to touch, the barrier of language. As yet no race of animals has produced a language. 113. The fold being real, ponderable, palpable, but insignificant, the intangible barrier of language, the one great barrier, 1:489, as he would later qualify it, was vast enough, in Muller's estimation, to forestall any possibility of an adulterating crossover. Of one truth Muller had no doubt, language, he announced triumphantly, is our Rubicon which no brute will dare to cross. 1xxxv, 490. This conceit, treated as both anxious hypothesis and reassuring axiom, underlies many of the assumptions in his lengthy 2-volume study of the science of language, assumptions that in turn underlie his anchored belief that comparative philology should properly be classified as a historical rather than, as the clergyman philologist Frederick William Farrar would insist, a natural science, since its primary object of inquiry was something possessing a material existence. Language, which had a real natural life. 21. As Pater had fixed on artifice, so Muller fixed on language as the differentia specifica that would preserve humanity from the progressive desacralization of an encroaching positivism. Huxley challenged Pater's mandate by arguing that protoplasm is the clay of the potter, which, bake it and paint it as he will, remains clay, separated by artifice, and not by nature, from the commonest brick or sun-dried clod. 135. The evolutionist and physiologist George Romanes, Muller's materialist opponent, leveled a similar challenge, warning that since it is to language that my opponents appeal, to language shall they go where, he implies, they will be humbled in the agglutinated dust and hopelessly condemned. 22. Muller, denouncing the arguments that had been put forth by Darwin and Romanes in support of the notion that the origins of language were strictly imitative, the bow wow and the poo-poo theories, as he deprecatingly called them, suggested that a more than human agency had been at work in the inception and evolution of language. What Bale had suggested of germinal matter, Muller echoed in hinting that language too was a divine gift, had its place in the general beauty and harmony of nature, in the midst of which the eye of man might discern the eye of God beaming out from the midst of all his works. 116. He resisted the empiricist orthodoxies of such brethren as Schleicher, who qualified what is very nearly a metaphysical speculation: our ancestors were not what we could call man from the beginning, but became human only when language appeared, by insisting upon a system and uttery of languages. Development of language, Schleicher urged, means the same for me as development of the brain and speech organs. 23. Whether or not it bore materially the sign of an inseminating logos, however, language nevertheless figured for Muller as an assurant utterance, a natural effect embodying an abstract principle. If we ourselves are right, he reasoned, in pointing to language as the one palpable distinction between man and brutes, it would seem to follow that language is the outward sign and realization of that inward faculty which is called the faculty of abstraction, but which is better known to us by the homely name of reason. 1:492. Language seen both as the sign system out of which innumerable texts might be constructed and as an encompassing text within which one might read the primeval and never-ending autobiography of our race, approached for Muller a sacramental condition, serving as the embodiment, the outward sign, of an ideality, that inward faculty. Point 24. The word is the thought incarnate. 1:527. The thought made flesh, and it was not to be expected that we could understand the real nature of the human self until we understood the real nature of language. Those who want to read the true history of the development of the soul of man, he announced, must learn to read it in language. 25. Having incrementally and almost incidentally moved in the direction of corporealizing the language he had undertaken to spiritualize, Muller went further, availing himself of the organicist metaphors common to the arguments of his colleagues, and thereby, as Romanes was quick to note, inadvertently laying the groundwork for his own defeat. Wary of the language's genealogical tree metaphor advanced by Friedrich Schlegel and others, Muller fancied instead a paleontological comparison in which the mass of human speech served as a fossil record of the history of language, whether in the petrified strata of ancient literature or in the countless variety of living languages and dialects. 125.26 More, however, than just a desiccated manuscript lying exposed to common view, a vast literary monument built up out of the ruins of the ancient languages. Language seemed the living and speaking witness of the whole history of our race, and since in its essential features it recalled all that had gone before, it also served as a witness that might yet connect us, through an unbroken chain of speech, with the very ancestors of our race, and might be thought of as still drawing its life from the first utterances of the human mind. 1:386.27. Falling just short, in this passage, of an explicit endorsement of its recapitulatory capacity, Muller eventually grants that language enacts what Haeckel had described as the ontogenious repetition of phylogenetic modifications, for one can infer the former existence of now extinct parts of speech by the changes wrought in the body of the word. 1:470. 71. Moreover, Muller was willing to conceive of language as an organic body, subject not merely to the laws of inheritance and adaptation, but to the diseases and disorders assailing the mutable bodies, both physical and linguistic, out of which it had emerged. Curiously, whereas Huxley had cast speech as a devitalizing activity, every word uttered by a speaker cost him some physical loss. 137. He wrote, Muller supposed that phonetic changes might easily follow from the ongoing physiological changes occurring within the body of the host. For a long time the usual phrase in linguistic works was, K becomes G, T becomes D, S becomes R, but how one letter could become another letter was never so much as asked. I believe I was the first to suggest the prosaic reason that all phonetic change was due to laziness, to an economy of muscular effort required in pronouncing vowels and consonants. 117. Linguistic decay was not limited to or necessarily contingent upon special or individual laziness or decrepitude, however, for language itself was prone to its own variety of decay, the virulence of this phonetic change, that will sometimes eat away the whole body of a word, and leave nothing behind but decay fragments. 153. Such a statement would constitute hardly an eddy within the general drift of the writings of someone like the comparative linguist Franz Bach, who had urged that languages be regarded as organic bodies, bearing within themselves an internal principle of life, and thus prone to develop and gradually die out, and to discard, mutilate, or misuse one's significant components or forms that have become superficial appendages. 27. It was, however, an extraordinary admission coming from one intent on refuting the notion of a merely mechanical agency of language, and bent instead on establishing its origins as something more esoteric than a fold of the brain or an angle of the skull. 1:490. The faculty of abstraction, better known by the homely name of reason. 1:492. Human reasoning itself being only a faint echo of that engaged in by the divinity. Such organic comparatives, so popular with philologists such as Wilhelm Bleek, Bach, Farrar, Schlegel, Schleicher, and even Muller himself, whose ambivalence betrays itself in his tendency to return to them after having drawn attention to their inexactitude, paved the way for literary and fictional treatments of language as subject both to sickness and to what Huysmans termed as slow and partial decay that eventually gives way to a purulent deliquescence. 28. Language might be viewed as one type of Pagerian artifice, a means by which humanity might stave off impermanency and decline, but it was also entirely possible to conclude, as the decadents, who thought of themselves as Pagerian disciples, were fully aware, that because language was a human construct, it might also bear what Mackin refers to as the brand of human imperfection. Terms such as lassitude, neurosity, depravity, and madness, for example, emerge in the various definitions of decadent language and style put forward by Max Beerbohm, Gautier, and Baudelaire. Their literary creations were afflicted by what Simons termed the maladie fin de siècle. As already noted, he had determined that decadent literature sought to emphasize and even flaunted its own debilities. 29. Nordau came to roughly the same conclusion when he characterized both art objects and literary creations as psychophysiologically accurate, capable, that is, of assuming the psychological and physiological stigmata of their makers. 30. Huysmans' De Scientia Literatura of no mean stature and a connoisseur of corrupted styles takes pleasure in reflecting upon the decline of the classical Latin tongue from a sound condition to a state in which it possesses a special gamey flavor to one in which it is dropping to pieces rotten through and hung like a decaying carcase, losing its limbs, oozing pus, barely keeping, in the general corruption of its body, a few sound parts, which the Christians removed in order to preserve them in the pickling brine of their new idiom. 31. This passage from a rigors which Nordock condemned as a debauch pathological and nauseous ideas of a deranged mind with gustatory perversion. 32 provides us with one example of the way in which scientific paradigms are trod in the literary artifacts of the culture from which they have emerged. Macken's The Great God Pan does more than merely redact key concepts or repeat terminology already made popular by the Huxleys and the Mullers. It is but one of many examples of the late Gothic that structure themselves around the body as text/text as body analogy that had become central to the arguments of biologists and philologists, and as such it exposes as well the anxieties of those familiar with those arguments or at least with the popularized distortions of them. When The Great God Pan appeared in the second volume of The Whirlwind in 1890, it was largely ignored by both readers and critics. In 1894 it resurfaced as the fifth book of John Lane's keynote series, with a frontispiece by Beardsley depicting a faun, which one reviewer mistook for a nymph whose admirably realized repulsiveness seemed well suited to the story. 33 In the company of such notorious pieces as Grant Allen's The Woman Who Did, Shields' Prince Selesky, and Fiona MacLeod's The Mountain Lovers, all of which had earned their place in the keynote series specifically because of their stylistic modishness or daring content, it attracted the attention that it had failed to receive 4 years earlier. Whereas the editors of the Westminster Gazette disparaged Macken's nightmares of corruption as examples of the type of story that was most truly decadent, Oscar Wilde was delighted to be able to declare The Great God Pan unsuccessful. Even as he rejoiced in the discovery that Machen was the author of our sacraments of evil, just as there is that of the sacraments of goodness. 34. Macken's macabre tale tells of a rash of suicides inspired by the actions of a creature, half human and half pagan god, whose birth is the result of an ill-conceived experiment in which Dr. Raymond, a typical Faustian overreacher, tampers with certain nerve cells in a woman's brain, thereby breaching the solid wall of sense that hides the real world from his patient's sight. This lifting of the veil, Raymond explains, was what the ancients meant when they spoke of seeing the god Pan. Something terrible happens to the woman, she experiences a brief moment of ecstasy, but she is immediately overwhelmed by a panic dread that leaves her hopelessly insane. The remaining 7 sections of the story detail the efforts of 3 men who set out, many years later, to uncover the identity of a beautiful and mysterious young woman who seems to have been intimately associated with certain men who have committed suicide or who met premature death under peculiar circumstances. Eventually, the men learn that the young woman's name is Helen Vaughan, that she is the daughter of Raymond's sacrificial patient and the god Pan, and that she has been amusing herself by introducing her male friends to her father. There are many things worth talking about in what is arguably the most celebrated story in the corpus of a writer whose powerful horror material of the 90s and earlier 1900s Lovecraft saw as standing alone in its class and marking a distinct epoch in the history of the tale of supernatural horror. 35 Of particular interest here, however, is an eyewitness's account of the manner of Helen's demise. Though horror and revolting nausea rose up within me, and an odor of corruption choked my breath, I remained firm. I was then privileged or accursed, I dare not say which, to see that which was on the bed, lying there black like ink, transformed before my eyes. The skin, and the flesh, and the muscles, and the bones, and the firm structure of the human body that I had thought to be unchangeable, and permanent as adamant, began to melt and dissolve. I knew that the body may be separated into its elements by external agencies, but I should have refused to believe what I saw. For here there was some internal force, of which I knew nothing, that caused dissolution and change. Here too was all the work by which man has been made repeated before my eyes. I saw the form waver from sex to sex, dividing itself from itself, and then again reunited. Then I saw the body descend to the beast whence it ascended, and that which was on the heights go down to the depths, even to the abyss of all being. The principle of life, which makes organism, always remained, while the outward form changed. The light within the room had turned to blackness, not the darkness of night, in which objects are seen dimly, for I could see clearly and without difficulty. But it was the negation of light, objects were presented to my eyes, if I may say so, without any medium, in such a manner that if there had been a prism in the room I should have seen no colors represented in it. I watched, and at last I saw nothing but a substance as jelly. Then the ladder was ascended again. Here the mist is illegible. For one instant I saw a form, shaped in dimness before me, which I will not farther describe. But the symbol of this form may be seen in ancient sculptures, and in paintings which survive beneath the lava, too foul to be spoken of as a horrible and unspeakable shape. Neither man, nor beast, was changed into human form, there came finally death. I who saw all this, not without great horror and loathing of soul, here write my name, declaring all that I have said on this paper to be true. Robert Matheson, Med. Dr. 36. This passage reveals, among other things, that Machen had not always subscribed to the dicta that he would later castigate Poe for having failed to uphold in some of his stories, that it is possible to overstep the point at which tragedy becomes melodrama and that decay and dissolution are far from being the supreme subject for the artist. 37 For dissolution defines this passage. Helen's death throws in body a reverse ontogeny, an accelerated retrogression to what Lovecraft described as the most primal manifestations of the life principle, what Machen himself would later call protoplasmic reversion. 3 Imposters, 124. 38 Unlike Rider Haggett's Aisha, whose spiraling descent is arrested once her outward form resolves itself into the simian shape of her more recent ancestors, her gracious form degenerating into that of a hideous little monkey frame, covered with crinkled yellow parchment, her shapeless face sealed with the stamp of unutterable age, Helen's body wantonly sheds the exovity of the ages, descending at length even to the abyss of all being. 39 The protoplasm into which Helen's outward form eventually melts is the sublimely object substance, indefinite, unstable, amorphous, and thus betrays its origins, for Helen's father is described as a similarly object creature, neither man nor beast, neither the living nor the dead, but all things mingled, the form of all things but devoid of all form. 176. Enacting a terrific version of the Phaedrian weaving and unweaving of the self, Helen's body becomes the quintessential site of Gothic horrors, and her death would certainly have piqued the fears of an audience, recalling with regret the days when it could complain of the encroaching frontier of a brute kingdom. For with the discovery of protoplasm had come the suggestion that humanity dwelt in what Huxley termed an intermediate kingdom, a sort of biological no man's land in which it is admittedly impossible to draw any distinct boundary line between the vegetable world and the animal, it being a mere matter of convention, as Huxley saw it, whether we call a given organism an animal or a plant. 13,435. But what, then, are we to think of language, the Rubicon and no brute, much less a plant, dare cross? The Great God Pan, with its emphasis on the illegible and the unspeakable, treats language as an organism without organs. The phrase is romances, one that seemed in danger, that is, of reverting to the primitive condition of structure characteristic of aboriginal Languages that have not yet undergone a differentiation into parts of speech 40 linguistically exhausted, structurally degenerative, the story itself suffers from an objection that reveals its atavistic character. The integrity of the narrative structure dissolves before the reader's eyes, though it falls into 8 sections, the various episodes appear to be randomly ordered, and after having encountered them all, the reader must struggle to discern the reticulated network of associations that bind them into a coherent whole. Displaying a polyphony precisely analogous to the polymorphousness of the material bodies whose actions and reactions they recount, the various narrative voices behave, not cacophonously, as do the dissociated voices in Eliot's The Wasteland, 1922, but rather as independent but interpenetrating fragments, each providing points and counterpoints within the larger movement that contains, even as it is defined by them. One voice blends almost imperceptibly into another, one interrupts or is absorbed into another, sometimes several clump together or merge. 41 Thus, Mr. Clark's memoirs, contained in 3 or 4 pages densely covered with Clark's round, set penmanship, are straightaway represented as being the singular narrative told me by my friend, Dr. Phillips, 181. More unsettling than the erratic manner in which the story progresses or the loosely futile principles it enunciates, however, are the lacunae that pock the narrative, for the great God Pan is rife with omissions, gaps, and silences. The various episodes are truncated, their conclusions inconclusive, manuscripts are sealed at just the moment when it would appear that long-sought revelations are imminent. Just as we are about to learn what it is that the anonymous Rachel M., half-dressed and weeping distractedly upon her bed, saw during her walk in the woods with Helen Baum, her childhood playmate, Mr. Clark. Dr. Raymond's accomplice snaps shut the book in which the wild story is recorded, punctuating his gesture with an outburst that, in essence, opens the book once again to further but unverifiable speculation. My God, think what you are saying. It is too incredible, too monstrous, such things can never be in this quiet world. 187. After a glance at only the first page of a manuscript produced by one of Helen Baum's victims, another character hurls the text from him, crying that the dread and horror of death itself are as nothing compared to this. 231. We also never learn by precisely what means Mrs. Beaumont, one of the several aliases by which the multifarious woman is known in London, induces her gentlemanly suitors to subject themselves to slow and torturous forms of suicide. Appropriately, the textual record of Helen Baum's death is the most corrupt and gnomic of all, taking the form of pencil jottings in Latin, Huysmans' suppurating language, contained in a chapter entitled Fragments. The transcription of her demise is followed by an epilogue that enacts a kind of narrative recapitulation. By returning to the house in Caermain where Helen had lived as a girl, Mr. Clark rounds off a story that began when he witnessed the ill-fated experiment during which she was conceived. While in Caermain, he finds a small pillar of white stone that had originally stood in a woods penetrated by a Roman road. Some of the letters are illegible, but Mr. Clark transcribes the inscription as follows. DEBOMNODENTI. FLABISSENILISBOSSBITPROPTERNVicious qua SBIDITSBBM bra. The local antiquaries were much puzzled, we are told, not by the inscription, or by any difficulty in translating it, but as to the circumstance or rite to which allusion is made. 241.42 The full implication of the Latin words is being ineluctably lost as the letters fall away from the bodies of the words, leaving behind fragments that admit of translation, but resist interpretation or contextualization. Any kind of significance is recuperable only by the literal bearing of the decayed linguistic residue in the body of a language not yet decomposed and thus able to contain the skeletal remains if not to help them resume their former shape and essential quality and power of definition. Romanes had elsewhere termed this degenerative condition of language the undifferentiated protoplasm of predication and had suggested that it was most readily to be observed in the language of the child which is just beginning to speak. 43 In alluding to the language of the child, Romanes not only provides a practical example of a phenomenon otherwise difficult to observe, but indirectly characterizes it for an audience who would have interpreted one term, language, in the light of the other, childhood, and understood both to imply recidivist, primitive, undeveloped conditions. 44 Moreover, his focus on the speech patterns of children qualifies him as a recapitulationist, one, that is, who has appropriated Haeckel's theory that in the course of their development to adulthood individuals reenact the evolutionary history of their species and evince, sequentially, characteristics of the adult ancestral forms. The evolution of the tribe, as he wrote in The Evolution of Man, 1874, which is dependent on the laws of heredity and adaptation, affects all the events which take place in the course of the evolution of the germ or embryo. 45 Thus, the child might truly be termed the father of the man, since children were by definition passing through a more primitive stage in the developmental history of their species. 2. Study the child of dominant cultures or, alternatively, the adults of inferior classes or races, whose childlike status and capacities drew marked attention among recapitulationists was, in essence, to resuscitate primitive man and make him, his modes of behavior, and his capabilities available for examination. By extension, to study the language patterns of the child or of a more primitive race was to hear the faint suspirations of what had been for their progenitors a newly congealed and only barely differentiated language. The idea had not originated with Romanes. As early as 1842, in his Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, Robert Chambers pitted the otherwise advanced Chinese for their language, which resembles that of children, or deaf and dumb people, the sentence of short, simple, unconnected words, in which an infant amongst us attempts to express some of its wants and its ideas the equally broken and difficult terms which the deaf and dumb express by signs. These are like the discourse of the refined people of the so-called Celestial Empire. 46 In the Time Machine, A Nightmare of Devolution, the Eloi, at once adult and child, provide a fictional illustration of this evolutionary phenomenon. Bodily, these Neotenous people, with their Dresden China prettiness, pink hands, hairless faces, and girlish rotundity of limb, represent the heights that the species has scaled, their bodily juvenilization expressive of an evolutionary advance over rudimentary progenitors. Linguistically, however, they have undergone recapitulation, for their language was excessively simple, almost exclusively composed of concrete substantives and verbs, with sentences usually simple and of 2 words. Bereft of abstract terms, of figurative language. 47 Their verbal system is sufficient to meet the needs of a people on the intellectual level of one of our 5-year-old children, for like children, they need express only the simplest propositions. 48 Wells is appropriating the findings of contemporary philologists who, in their investigations into the mysterious first principles of language, had already determined, with Romanes, that languages become simpler in their structure the further they are traced backwards, until we arrive at their so-called roots, so that one finds in the primitive condition of language structure that every noun and every verb was originally by itself a complete sentence, consisting of a subject and predicate fused into one not yet differentiated into the two, much less into the three parts which now go to constitute the fully evolved structure of a proposition. 49 Romances was a theory with which Mackin must have been familiar at the time of his writing The Great God Pan, for in the novel of the Black Seal, 1895, a later story similarly inclined to the protoplasmic character recalls being struck by the phrase articulate speaking man in Homer, taking this as evidence of the fact that the writer knew or had heard of men whose speech was so rude that it could hardly be termed articulate, had known or heard, that is, of folk equipped with a jargon but little removed from the inarticulate noises of rude beasts, and exemplifying, apparently, Darwin's bow wow theory. Point 50 The narrative hesitations as well as the stylistic disruptions of The Great God Pan thus serve as signposts of linguistic and structural degeneration that we might think of as being analogous to biological and cultural dissolution. Bauer, for example, treated textual decomposition both as a correlative of organismal degeneration and as a symptom of cultural breakdown and decay. In his view, a decadent style emerges when an advanced society is poised at the threshold of or already embarked upon its decline. Such a society, he argued in his essays De Psychologie Contemporaine, 1883, is like an organism in that it may be resolved into a federation of smaller organisms, which may themselves be resolved into a federation of cells. If the energy of the cells becomes independent, the lesser organisms will likewise cease to subordinate their energy to the total energy, and the anarchy which is established constitutes the decadence of the whole. Given that the law governing the development and decadence of the social organism also governs that other organism which we call language, the latter, by necessity, an appendage of the former, a decadent style will betray itself, he argues, in a textual and linguistic atomization made manifest when the unity of the book is decomposed to give place to the independence of the page, when that of the page is decomposed to give place to the independence of the phrase, and when that of the phrase gives place to the independence of the word. 51 As cultures and societies decay, language may also decay, and in the stories discussed here, we see the effects when a society is exposed to and reinfected by the noxious or destructive influences bred by the poisonous texts, the yellow books of the decadence that it has itself engendered. Point 52 Thus, fearing contagion, the narrator of Chambers as the yellow sign refuses to come into contact with the fatal play The King in Yellow. I had long ago decided that I should never open that book, and nothing on earth could have persuaded me to buy it. Fearful lest curiosity might tempt me to open it, I had never even looked at it in bookstores. If I ever had had any curiosity to read it, the awful tragedy of young Castine, whom I knew, prevented me from exploring its wicked pages. I had always refused to listen to any description of it, and indeed, nobody ever ventured to discuss the second part aloud, so I had absolutely no knowledge of what those leaves might reveal. I stared at the poisonous yellow mottled binding as I would at a snake. Point 53. In Nana, Zola resorts to the same protoplasmic vocabulary that drives Mackin's dark conceit, both as a means of fleshing out the portrait of Venus rotting featured at the novel's end and as a means of animating his representation of a social organism corrupted by that which it had itself perverted. Our final glimpse of Nana, the woman who, no matter how dissolute her life, has looked always clean and solid and as brand new as if she had never seen service, is of a being dissolving in a heap of matter and blood, a shovelful of corrupted flesh, her face a formless pulp in which one eye had completely foundered among bubbling purulence while the other remained half open, looking like a deep black ruinous hole. The nose was suppurating, and the mouth was invaded by quite a large reddish crust peeling from one of the cheeks. 54 Lest his readers might somehow manage to overlook what he has been at pains to articulate, namely, Nana's rage for debasing things, for destroying and soiling them, and for leaving abominable traces upon whatever her delicate hands had broken. Zola makes explicit at his novel's close the connection between the moral and the physical basis of her life. It seemed as though the poison she had assimilated in the gutters, and on the carrion tolerated by the roadside, the leaven with which she had poisoned the whole people, had but now remounted to her face and turned it to corruption. 55. Zola's sociological analysis recalls the monogenistic view that Morel had developed in his extended study of heredity and the degeneration of the human species, in which he speaks of the various human races as so many morbid deviations from a primitive type from the original type that he thought of as having been uncorrupted until social and cultural evils had acted upon it. Point 56 Mackin's description of protoplasmic horrors, on the other hand, with its own not very covered sexual subtext, emphasizes the devolutionary quality of degeneracy, the tendency of organic entities of human bodies, for example, and bodies of writing to retrogress from a complex and specialized state to one undifferentiated, primitive, and, as Nordau would have it, even brutish. Point 57 Both Zola and Mackin, however, emphasize the essentially corruptive and by extension the transgressive power of the decadent bodies with which they are obsessed. Nana crosses class boundaries, drawing her victims from both the highest and the lowest levels of the society that has corrupted her. Even more unruly than that of the uncontrollable Nana, the body of Mackin's Helen Vaughan defies physical and intellectual limitations, just as the gelatinous plasma sealed within her body oozes out from beneath the skin stretched over them, eventually consuming the organism that they formerly fed. Her morbid dissolution triggers a correspondingly physiological response in the doctor who, witnessing Helen Vaughan's demise, melts and dissolves accordingly. Horror and revolting nausea rose up within me, and an odor of corruption choked my breath. 236. Her bodily exudations are vaguely mirrored in his response, gagging and rushing being one means by which the body voids insalubrious matter or responds to noxious influences. In this sense, her body may be said to exist in two places at once, both within itself and within the body that registers its infectious presence physically. If contemporary responses to Mackin's conceit may be taken as a gauge, then her bodily revolt is more radically transgressive still, violating not integumentary and spatial encasements only, but fictional borders as well. Only too ready to dismiss it as so much baby satanic Tommy rot, its worried nastiness fit reading only for those who are morbid and unhealthy in mind. Many of Mackin's reviewers fixed however sardonically upon the story's distinctly physiological and pathological qualities, treating it as though it were a diseased body in need of quarantining. W. L. Courtney of the Daily Telegraph, for example, assumed the role of a physician and diagnosed the text as suffering from the yellow book disease, a very virulent form of jaundice, due to an imperfect digestion and a morbid condition of liver. 58 Metaphors involving digestion or, more accurately, indigestion and accompanying nausea abound in the various commentaries on Mackin's work. A reviewer from the Dundee Advertiser concluded that the sorts of visions one encounters in the protoplasmically predisposed the three impostors have before been given to little boys who complained of headache and divers other pains, but whose sufferings are ultimately traced by the family doctor back to mince pies and pickles. Another, speaking for the Athenaeum, pointed out that the same story produces on the normal waking mind much the same effect as a hearty supper of pork chops on the dream fancies of a person of delicate digestion, villa egrisomnia, venifinguntur species. 59. Although their original intent was satirical, these reviews also remind us that, as Aidan Reynolds and William Charlton have put it, such stories treat of horror elevated to the intellectual plane without losing its nauseousness. Horror, that is, which is capable of overleaping the boundaries of the text that contains it and of conflating divergent orders of being and awareness, exerting a physical as well as an intellectual influence upon the reader. Point 60. As has already been suggested, the Great God Pan was designed to produce in the reader the symptoms of confusion, indeterminacy, and destabilization that are integral both to many of the theories that had emerged in the biological sciences and to similar horror stories that had also adopted materialist principles, phylogenetics, degeneration, and recapitulation as their subject matter and also as their source of horror, which in this case may be equated with the sort of abjection defined by Julia Christave as what disturbs identity, system, order. What does not respect borders, positions, rules. The in between, the ambiguous, the composite. 61. In their unveiling not merely of a decompositive body occupying an otherwise unthinkable plane of existence, but also of those other bodies that are degraded by what is itself degraded, many works of fin de siècle horror explore precisely this form of abjection, which seeks to elicit a physical response in the reader, a visceral shudder or a sense of physical aversion brought on by the propinquity of something lacking cleanliness or health, something degenerative, radically separate, loathsome. Often something unamiable. Point 62. The propriety of such a response is never in doubt because in all such stories the hero or narrator reacts in precisely the same fashion, setting an example, as it were, for the reader to follow. Thus, in the presence of atavistic behavior rather than actual physical degeneration, the narrator of John Buchan's The Grove of Ashtaroth, 1912, feels an overpowering repugnance, growing sick with disgust, not terror, but honest physical loathing. 63. Stevenson's Mr. Utterson seeks urgently for a term with which to describe the peculiar quality. There must be something else. There is something more, if I could find a name for it, that inspires the hitherto unknown disgust, loathing, and fear, the nausea and distaste of life that he and others feel in the presence of the pale and dwarfish Mr. Hyde. Point 64. Made desperate by his own exposure to the A, B, O, and thus prompted to cross a social boundary that he would never otherwise have transgressed, Peluther seeks the company of a caretaker who, as he approaches Peluther's contaminated house, speaks of a physical revulsion made worse by his inability to determine its cause. Say, Master, what is moving in the house? Why is my EAD all damp, and my aunt's a shiverin'? I tell you there's a thing gone wrong in the place. In Stoker's Dracula, Jonathan Harker records in his diary that he could not repress a shudder when the Count was in close proximity. It may have been that his breath was rank, but a horrible feeling of nausea came over me, which, do what I would, I could not conceal. 65. When he encounters Dr. Moreau's beast people, but before he is aware that he is in the company of hybrid monstrosities, Wells's Edward Prendick responds to a something in their faces he knows not what that triggers in him a queer spasm of disgust, a shuddering recoil, and a nasty little sensation, a tightening of his muscles, whereas what begins for his time traveler as a peculiar shrinking from the pallid bodies of beings who are filthily cold to the touch in turn leads to an irrevertible feeling of deadly nausea in response to something, the sickening quality of the Morlocks, something inhuman and malign. Instinctively I loathed them. 66. Each of these stories in its own way recalls the archetypal story of nausea. Pose the facts in the case of M. Valdemar, 1845, in which no person present even affected to deny, or attempted to repress, the unutterable, shuddering horror that the few audible words uttered by the living corpse were so well calculated to convey. 67. The reactions of those in attendance vary in degree. A medical student swoons, the nurses flee the death chamber and refuse to return, but all become nauseous and are barely able to repress the hysterical vomiting that Freud identified in his study of the etiology of hysteria as symptomatic of the conjunction of great fright and an experience justifiably productive of a high amount of disgust. For example, the ghastly and revolting sight of a decomposing dead body. 68. The physiology of fear that Lovecraft fixes on is, he claims, constructed out of the exact lines and proportions that connect up with the latent instincts or hereditary memories of fright and that stir the dormant sense of strangeness. 69. Although indicative of a related physiology, the sickening quality that disconcerts Utterson and the time traveler is located for the reader not in the lines but in the intervening spaces, in the pauses, the linguistic lapses, the qualifying auxiliaries it may have been, and the elliptical nouns that seem to name something, something else, something more, something inhuman but mean almost nothing. The decomposing or otherwise unstable body elicits an analogous regression in the observer, who lacks a vocabulary sufficient to describe the encounter. My own impressions, laments the witness to Valdemar's mesmeric rapport, I would not pretend to render intelligible to the reader. The living corpse produces sounds that have never before jarred upon the ear of humanity, such as it would be madness in me to attempt describing. There are, indeed, 2 or 3 epithets which might be considered as applicable to it in part. I might say, for example, that the sound was harsh and broken and hollow, but the hideous whole is indescribable. M. Valdemar 3:1240. The shuddering, spasming, and swooning of those who witness such horrors amount to a visceral expression of an emotion analogous to the sympathy that Darwin saw as permitting us, when confronted by a frightened person, to put ourselves in the position of the sufferer, and feel something akin to his fear. Under such circumstances, the muscular system contracts in much the same way that Darwin's facial muscle of fear contracts in the presence of another's fright, thus allowing the body to express in its own appropriately primitive language its awareness of the proximity of the unhamlet and, through it, the imminence of things buried, occulted, and repressed. 70. Those who must find a way to express the nauseating quality of their experience often turn to the realm where the corporeal and the conceptual overlap, so that Poe's narrator, fearing that it will be impossible to make himself comprehended, notes that the dying Valdemar's voice impressed him synesthetically as gelatinous or glutinous matters impress the sense of touch. 3:1240. Poe's story articulates a mordant pun. Valdemar, continuing to report on his own decay, becomes a memorable example of what may be comprehended in the phrase in articulo mortis. 3:1233. Trapped in their pre-Freudian nightmare worlds, such tongue-tied characters, Valdemar's tongue is swollen and blackened, exposed to view with the falling away of his lower jaw, seek to express an irrevertible something that triggers an unamiable response, a condition that may best be described as the uncanny, the unhamlet. Their encounter with the unhamlet coincides with a momentary surcease of expressiveness, in a stifling of speech signaling an abrupt reversion to hereditary memories, latent instincts, perhaps instinctive loathing. 71. Freud, a confirmed recapitulationist, associated the uncanny with absences and lapses, with what is concealed, kept from sight, so that others do not get to know more about it, withheld from others something hidden and dangerous, the meaning of hamlet usually ascribed to what ought to be its opposite. The ambiguous unhamlet. 72. Moreover, what is hidden, not revealed, kept from sight is also in reality nothing new or alien, he continues, but something which is familiar and old established in the mind and which has become alienated from it only through the process of repression. This reference to the factor of repression enables us, furthermore, to understand Schelling's definition of the uncanny as something which ought to have remained hidden, but has come to light. 73. The unheimlich provides us with another way of reading and naming the shuddering silences that emerge in response to encounters with bodies that have regressed or are in the process of devolving to former states of being, infecting what is around them. That uncanny moment is expressed textually by the silence in which the narrative decomposes literally unwrites itself as verbal and linguistic systems become infected and inflected by what ails them. Although the witness to Helen's death attempts to remain firm, its disgust is so intense that it precludes him from writing legibly, and thus he creates a corrupt record of a corrupt death, much abbreviated, 235, illegible at those points at which his horror and nausea and loathing of soul symptomatic of his own imminent dissolution render him speechless. As the virulence of phonetic change, to return to Muller's biolinguistic hypothesis, will sometimes eat away the whole body of a word, and leave nothing behind but decay fragments, Muller 153, so the virulence associated with devolutionary change will sometimes eat away not only the body itself, leaving behind only decay fragments or unctuous patches, but other bodies in close proximity, and even, if the decadent author has his way, the verbal structures, the sentences, the pages, the texts in which they are contained, crossing in this way over yet another order, disturbing yet another order. The lacunae of Macken's story dissolve one final barrier that which, according to Sven Todorov, naturally arises out of our inability to forget, when we read, that it is only literature and not life. 74. By knowing, or pretending to know, more than it reveals, the text forces us, against our better judgment and even against our will, to reveal more about our inner selves than we wish to know, forcing us to speculate and, in speculating, to confront what is otherwise occulted and concealed. When the text falters, we falter as well and are drawn into its decline. Forced to fill in the gaps and omissions with material drawn from private reserves of guilt and anxiety, we discover or invent in the white and decomposing spaces that which proves as infectious as the odor of corruption emanating from the various degradations to which the story's characters are exposed, the regressive, instinctual feelings that combine to make up what Lovecraft termed the hereditary impulse and what Freud, Lovecraft's contemporary, would recast, in psychoanalytical terms, as what is known of old and long familiar. 75. The brothers de Goncourt reveal the potentially corrupting role of the elliptical silence when, in a journal entry, they recall the commissioner of police who had played with the idea of prosecuting the unnamed author of a line of asterisks which appeared in a number of L.E. Paris and which had seemed obscene to the same M. Latour. Dumoulin. 76. In his defense of his notorious novel of the 1890s, Wilde makes explicit what is only hinted at in the de Goncourt journal entry, the revelatory nature of the unspoken and suppressed. Each man, Wilde writes, sees his own sin in Dorian Gray. What Dorian Gray's sins are no one knows. He who finds them has brought them. And again, he announces that the work of art that is rich and vital and complete will fill the cowardly with terror, and the unclean will see in it their own shame. It will be to each man what he is himself. 77. Required to play their own role in the collaborative effort to resuscitate meaning, readers are invited to imagine a private confrontation with the great god Pan, encouraged to ask themselves what secret horror Helen Bond's victims' conscripted visionaries could have looked upon that made them long for death. Few other horror writers of the period Conrad accepted were in the end so readily associated as Machen was with an elliptical style in which, as one critic complained, much is intimated and little is told. 78. Although an appreciative Lovecraft might credit the gradual hints and revelations with the cumulative suspense and ultimate horror with which every paragraph of the great god Pan abounds, William Rose Bennett, another contemporary, angrily condemned Machen as an ellipsist who, though he was not at all sure of the incidents he described, tended to transcribe them in his own particular hieroglyphic. 79. Most emphatically, then, Bennett did not share Lovecraft's opinion that the charm of Macken's stories lay in the telling. 80. Perhaps the richest tribute or, alternatively, the most creative insult paid to Machen on this score was the parody A Yellow Creeper, 1895, dedicated by its author, Arthur Rickett, to the author of The Great God Pan, and the Inmost Light. In this brief jeu d'esprit, the doctor mixes a green fluid with a red fluid, which, when he adds to it something black, becomes a clear, limpid, crystal-like fluid, a chemical compound in which R2O-T3 reacts on its agent P4IFF5Le6. When a small quantity of this agent is dropped upon an unsuspecting fly, the blue bottle paused stupefied, then it lubricated its legs together with violence, gave a fearful buzz of despair, and turned into an old blowfly. Only for a second. It rapidly became a red bottle, best scotch, then an alligator, a scarecrow, a Beardsley poster, and finally dissolved into nothing. 81. Of interest in this spoof as in the precursor text to which it playfully responds is the concluding section, the written statement of a witness to the experiment. I, Dr. Buncombe, have been asked to recount what I saw. My knowledge of the English language is but slight, owing to the excessive attention given in early manhood to the classical subjects in the Literato. But I will do my best. When I was called in, the temperature of the room was 212 degrees Fahrenheit, and a green twilight suffused everything. I am a stolid man, but my pulse beat 599 to the minute, yet I retained my self-control. The thing was buzzing fiercely after a dissipated course of fly papers. I felt its pulse, and gave it a bottle of influenza mixture. It rapidly grew worse. It resembled a saneless, painless, brainless lump of blue jelly. Neither male nor female, animal, vegetable or mineral. Then it began to dissolve. I have been at the dissolution of Parliament, but never have I. Yet words fail. I crept under a copy of the Westminster Gazette, and waited for the finale. No, excuse me, I did not wait. I hurried out, wrote down my impressions for the public, and then made my will. When these pages are being read, I shall probably be either dead or living. 82. With its sardonic linking of viscosity and silence, Rickett's parody succeeds because it recreates, intensifies, and exaggerates the defining characteristics not only of Macken's style. The spontaneous reticences rendered typographically by means of dashes, exclamation points, and semicolons, as in I have been at the dissolution of Parliament, but never have I, yet words fail, but also of his fictional universe, the blue bottle degenerating into a saneless, painless, brainless lump of blue jelly. There were those among Macken's contemporaries who showed a more sober appreciation of the expressiveness of textual silences. Mallarmé, for example, believed, as Wilde did, in the potency of interstitial blanks, claiming that the intellectual armature of the poem must be hidden. It is contained, it lives in the very spaces which isolate the stanzas, and all through the whiteness of the paper, meaningful silence which gives no less pleasure in its composition than the verses themselves. 83. Simons proposed that Pater's prose style found a large part of mastery in reticence, in knowing what to omit. 84. In the essay entitled Silence that introduces his book of meditations, L.E. Tressert Humbles, 1896, Maurice Maeterlinck confesses his reverential attitude toward those writers who cultivate silence and whose works commune in divine silence. Echoing Carlyle's insistence that silence is the element in which great things fashion themselves together, that at length they may emerge, full-formed and majestic, into the daylight of life, which they are henceforth to rule, Maeterlinck goes on to note in turn that as gold and silver are weighed in pure water, so does the soul test its weight in silence, and the words that we let fall have no meaning apart from the silence that wraps them round. 85 For such writers, silence is a shaping force, helping to construct not merely the overall design of a work of art but also the reader's attitude toward and response to the artifact. Like the holes in Hugo's blot, those burned-out passages that silently comment upon the lacy figurations that contain them, stylistic absences and omissions call attention to themselves, complementing the elaborately worked prose sections they abut. When strategically placed, they can be more expressive in their reticence than words would otherwise be in their self-aware, and often doomed, attempts to fix meaning. The omissions and ellipses of Macken's story disclose an essentially decompositive strategy, betraying language's constitutional vulnerability to the anthropic forces that surround and beset it as they simultaneously induce the emotional and intellectual short circuits in which reason gives way to elemental human emotions to fear, anxiety, and shame. Though we suffer an emblematic death in those spaces, however, we are productive in them as well, for we must become the co-creators of an evolving horror that, in blasting speech, renders speechlessness expressive. At such moments and in such spaces, a decompositional urge sits astride the procreative urge. Georges Baltracettes put it another way: the deformation that radically decomposes a body is also a formation. 86. Pater anticipated such a view when, in reminding his readers that an undefinable taint of death awakened in Rousseau the literary sense, he acknowledged that visionary gestures are often born of mortal disease. 220. In this passage from the conclusion, vitalist and materialist perspectives converge, for Huxley had also argued that we not only live in the midst of death, but batten upon it, under whatever disguise it takes refuge, whether fungus, or oak, worm or man, the living protoplasm not only ultimately dies and is resolved into its mineral and lifeless constituents, but is always dying, and, strange as the paradox may sound, could not live unless it died. 136. His imminent recourse to mutton, Huxley informed his readers, would prove a necessary, a creative, and even an occult act, for in eating he would transubstantiate sheep into man and thereby raise the complex substance of dead protoplasm to the higher power of living protoplasm. 137-38. Such physiological certainties would later be raised to the higher power of a living truth of the sort extolled by the 20th century Dutch writer Multatula, whose aesthetic, he claimed, was fed by the notion that he who dreads putrefaction is an enemy of life. 87.